Now, a couple weeks ago, we had an interview with Daniel Ellsberg about his recent book, The Doomsday Machine, and the purpose of that interview was to highlight the ongoing nature of nuclear war and international nuclear conflict, whether intentional or accidental. But we have a nuclear problem in some ways, or at least for some of us, even closer to home today, and that's the question, the matter of radioactive waste. Our next guest has been closely involved with the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in the state of Washington, and it's something we should know more about. So Bruce Amundson is a doctor. He is a family physician. He is also a leader in the Spokane branch of Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is a terrific group, and he's been very involved in shining a spotlight on the Hanford Reservation and the issues there. So without further ado, Dr. Amundson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Richard. I'm happy to join you. I've been involved with the Hanford Site and its implications for over 35 years. And just to review, I think most people don't realize the magnitude of this site and the role that it played. As part of the Manhattan Project, which included 3 sites, Hanford, Oak Ridge, and Los Alamos, Hanford was a primary site for production of plutonium in the beginning of the Cold War and weapons production. And at its peak, it had 9 plutonium production reactors on site producing plutonium. Now, it was located in the current site along the Columbia River because there was a need for massive amounts of water, which were involved in cooling the reactor sites. For example, one of the reactors took 70,000 gallons a minute of water to cool the reactor as the uranium was being irradiated to produce plutonium. So the site is on the banks of the Columbia River. It covers 580 square miles. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the, quote, cleanup that's been underway for years now, which is primarily what's going on in Hanford, all production of plutonium stopped in the late 1960s. The B reactor, which was the first plutonium production reactor itself, involves 30 buildings and 20 service facilities, as well as a massive reactor containing the plutonium production itself. So in the cleanup that's going on, cleanup is somewhat of a misnomer for Hanford.
Well, let me just jump in for a second, because I think a lot of our listeners may not even know the current state. I mean, this is an enormous site, but what is the current status of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation? And then what is the cleanup that's taking place? I think it'd be good to go over that.
The current status is there is no production of anything going on at the site. The entire industry now is the cleanup. On the site is the only nuclear power reactor that exists in Washington, but that's separate from the entire war-making capability. That's the nuclear power plant. So all of the industry involved there now, involving billions of dollars per year, is focused on the cleanup.
So, okay, so basically, Hanford is out of the business of producing weapons-grade material. So, you have this enormous facility. I think people, that's why it was valuable for you to describe it, Dr. Amundson, because you have this, I don't think people realize the magnitude of this operation that was once taking place there. And in effect, you're having to try to safely decommission or dismantle this sort of mini city dedicated to the production of deadly radioactive materials. Isn't that fair to say?
That's right. And there are 2 kind of elements of the contamination and waste, Richard. The first is what they call low-level radiation waste, which is everything related to contaminated soil, the contamination of the buildings, debris. All of that is being dismantled systematically. And since you can't get rid of radiation, nothing is going off the Hanford site. So in the center of the 590 square miles up on the plateau is a massive facility that is called the Environmental Restoration Disposal Site, covering hundreds of acres, which basically is where all of the waste material, except for the high-level waste I can describe in a minute, is being buried in gigantic landfills. And to give you an idea of the scope of that, the trucks that haul the waste as these buildings and complexes are being dismantled and soil is being dug up and so forth have traveled 12 million miles since 1996 just hauling debris to the center of the site. That's the scope of the cleanup.
So you have this massive cleanup taking place, and with what sounded like a sort of Orwellian named disposal site there, environmental restoration or whatever. And just so for people who don't know the geography there, first of all, I might have mispronounced the name of the city. I think it's Spokane, and I said Spokane, but you can correct me on that. I think, just so that people know, where is this site relative to human population centers and so on?
Yes, it's about 180 miles southeast of the Seattle complex and about 150 miles southwest of Spokane. So it's basically in a rural high desert area. The only cities around it are those that grew up around the Hanford complex, Richland and Pasco, which are now fairly modest-sized cities. But the location, partly it was chosen because of the isolation, because, of course, of the secrecy, partly because of the need for access to massive amounts of water from the Columbia River, and partly because of the access to cheap power from the Hoover Dam. The power consumption was massive. So it's in south central Washington, basically in the high desert.
So you have this site in south central Washington, and basically you have this sort of history of enormous secrecy there. You were part of the effort, as I understand it, to get a Freedom of Information Act release of information on the site, and I think you found some disturbing things in that, if I understand correctly. Is that right?
Yeah, this is really a poorly understood history. Of course, our entire history of weapons production, nuclear material production was clothed in secrecy from the beginning of the Manhattan Project, and the beginning of plutonium production in about 1944, and up until the early 1980s, so more than 40 years, for all of the weapons production labs, Oak Ridge, Livermore, Los Alamos, Hanford, the claim of the federal government and the Department of Energy was that no radiation ever leaked off the sites of any of these production sites, and that was their official position. And then, because people began to surface that lived around there telling tales about people in white garments and protective masks out in their fields in the 40s and 50s, there was a suspicion that that really was not true. The Spokane chapter of Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility, together with a local advocacy group called the Hanford Education Action League, filed a Freedom of Information Act to get information on the so-called green run, when large amounts of radiation were released, we found out later. From that FOIA, the Department of Energy released thousands of pages of documents which revealed that massive amounts of radiation had escaped by air from the extraction of the plutonium with chemicals early in the 40s and the 50s. It basically blew the culture of secrecy off the sites. And after that, there was a revealing documents at all of these sites around contamination, both air and water, from the whole nuclear production chain. So this was a major advancement in terms of unleashing information for the public that occurred in about 1985.
We're talking with Dr. Bruce Amundson about the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. So what would the health implications be of that kind of release of radiation into the air? And if Hanford released radiation into the water, you're talking about the Columbia River, in a major body of water in the state of Washington. What are the environmental and health implications of these releases?
Yeah, two things. Let me back up a moment. You asked about the sort of the waste and the cleanup. I talked about the low-level waste. The major concern right now, both for the site and for the public, is the high-level waste. And here's the history. As plutonium was being extracted, all of the chemicals and the uranium rods that were left over from the plutonium were extremely toxic radiation-wise. And so that waste stream was stored in a series of steel tanks that are constructed on the site. There's 177 steel tanks. They're massive. They're up to 1 million gallons. They're buried in the soil. And 144 of those were just single steel wall tanks. Later, they were double steel wall. They were meant to be temporary. They've now existed for more than 50 years. And at least 30 of those have leaked water into the soil. It's the material in those tanks that's a combination of uranium residue, a range of chemicals that are involved in the extraction that they've been pumping the liquid from to try to minimize the waste leakage into the soil into the double wall tanks that are still intact. And what remains in those tanks is a steaming, hot material that is largely sludge. They call it like salt cake. It's a combination between sand and sludge that they have to remove that ultimately will be dealt with in a vitrification process to create glass blocks for permanent storage. But the removal of that material, which all has to be done remotely from these massive tanks, is the current dilemma and the risk. Now, in terms of off-site contamination, there has been documentation of releases at Hanford and other sites, releases into the air, also into waterways and into the soil. Much of the cooling water was simply stored in trenches. It was pumped in billions of gallons into trenches, and that's been part of the soil. It has to be extracted and deposited in this landfill. But in terms of demonstrations of impact on human health, the problem has been that there have been almost no epidemiologic studies of the releases of radiation from the various nuclear production laboratories and websites. They occurred years ago, that the research was difficult, and the only systemic study that's been done was done at Hanford, which was to study the releases, potential health impacts, the releases from the huge volumes of iodine-131 that were released into the air from the extraction of plutonium in the late 40s and early 50s. I was a part of that study. It was conducted by the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. And in spite of a very sophisticated study actually tracking down people that were children during that time and would have been exposed to milk products, which was the route of contamination from the air to hay to feeding of cattle to milk, that study did not show an increase in health effects, either benign or thyroid cancers, on folks that were exposed, which was a great surprise to many of us and a great dismay to many of those that lived in the area that believed that their health was impacted.
So what should we only have about a minute left, but Dr. Amundson, what should people know in the state of Washington or around the country, and what should they learn regarding this issue of nuclear production and nuclear waste disposal?
That there's contamination at all of the nuclear weapons laboratories around the country. Those have not been cleaned up adequately. Workers were exposed. Worker compensation has been a problem. And the continuing cleanup and waste stream from our nuclear production activities over the 20 years that went on continues to be a legacy that puts people at risk both on these sites and off. And the federal government continues to minimize and underfund the cleanup from waste from our weapons production complexes.
Well, very well said, and very important story. And thank you for your good work on this, Dr. Bruce Amundson, and all Physicians for Social Responsibility, as well as practicing physician. And thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me, Richard.